Okay, so everything you think you know about the Library of Alexandria? Total lie. It wasn't torched in one afternoon by some angry general storming in with a torch, screaming orders while scrolls burn behind him. That story's basically fan fiction, the kind of scene Hollywood loves, but historians roll their eyes at. The real one's slower, and honestly, way messier, and it took way longer to actually kill this place than any. But here's the real kicker. What if it never disappeared? Like, what if every scroll, every science text, every scrap of math and medicine in that place just kept getting copied for the next 1,000 years, generation after generation, the way ideas are supposed to survive? Would we already be living on Mars right now? Would cancer already be curable? Stick with me, because by the end of this you're going to know exactly what we lost, why the burning story is straight-up myth, and what our world could look like today if things had gone differently. Everybody pictures the same scene, right? One huge dramatic fire, thousands of scrolls going up in smoke in a single afternoon, centuries of human knowledge gone just like that. What actually went down took almost 300 years, not one night, not one villain, but 3 whole centuries of small losses stacking up. Julius Caesar's fire in 48 BC pretty much torched some warehouses down by the docks while he was fighting a completely different war, not the actual library, even though that's the version that ended up in half the textbooks. That famous story about an Arab general burning it in 641 CE doesn't even show up until centuries later, written by people who weren't there, and it reads way more like political legend than actual documented history. Funny enough, early Muslim scholars were some of the people preserving and translating Greek texts during that exact era, building massive libraries of their own in places like Baghdad and Cordoba, not burning anything. So if there wasn't one villain, wasn't one fire, what actually killed the Library of Alexandria? Before we get into the what if, you gotta understand what actually vanished, because it's easy to just say knowledge was lost without feeling the weight of it. We're not talking basic stuff like the wheel or how to pour concrete. That kind of practical knowledge spread all over the Mediterranean through trade and travel, so losing one library wasn't gonna wipe that out. What we lost was depth, the deep cuts, the advanced stuff that only existed in a handful of copies. Sophocles alone wrote over 120 plays in his lifetime. Today, we've got seven out of over 100. And he's just one writer. Multiply that kind of loss across math, astronomy, medicine, geography, and engineering, and you start to see just how massive this loss really was. We're not talking about one genius's work disappearing. We're talking about entire fields of study getting cut off mid-sentence, with nobody around 100 years later even knowing what questions had already been answered. And that's exactly where the what if gets good, because the loss wasn't total and it wasn't instant. Which means there's a version of history out there, a version where the funding never dries up, where this never even happens. Picture this instead. The Mouse Ion, basically the research institute the library was actually part of, keeps its funding decade after decade. The wars that mess up Alexandria over those centuries either don't happen, or they just don't reach the royal quarter where all the scrolls are kept. Scribes keep recopying scrolls onto fresh papyrus, generation after generation, kind of like what monks did later on with medieval manuscripts, except this never stopped. Now stretch that out over 1,000 years. A library that actually survives isn't just some dusty old museum of scrolls sitting there for tourists. It's a living, breathing research institution, still pulling in scholars from every corner of the known world, still growing, still arguing, still discovering new things for 1,000 more years. Think observatories getting built next door. Think dissection rooms, translation departments, entire wings added generation after generation. Think about how losing one password, one crashed hard drive, can wipe out years of your own work in like 2 seconds. Projects, photos, ideas, just gone, no backup, no way to get it back. Now imagine that happening to human civilization's entire body of scientific knowledge, over and over, for centuries, every single time a new war rolls through or a new ruler decides funding for scholars isn't a priority. Except in this timeline, here's where it gets genuinely wild. Ancient scholars had already figured out that the Earth was round. This wasn't some medieval myth about flat Earth believers. That's actually a much later misconception. And one librarian in particular, that kind of thinking didn't die out because it was wrong. It died out because nobody kept building on it for over 1,000 years. The knowledge just sat there, undisturbed, while the people who could have used it were busy fighting wars or just trying to survive. And the next scholar who could have picked up where Eratosthenes left off simply never showed up or never heard about the work in the first place. If that momentum never breaks, you're not just looking at a slightly earlier Renaissance. You're looking at a snowball effect, astronomy, medicine, engineering, all moving forward on one continuous thread instead of hitting reset. And that snowball effect is exactly why historians call this one of the most consequential what-ifs in all of history. Not because of what burned in some dramatic fire, but because of what stopped quietly, with nobody even noticing at the time. Push this far enough, and the ripple effects get straight up uncomfortable to think about. A continuous scientific tradition could mean the printing press shows up centuries early, meaning ideas spread to ordinary people instead of staying locked away in a handful of libraries. Could mean germ theory and real medicine developing before something like the Black Death ever gets the chance to wipe out a third of Europe and kill tens of millions of people. Could mean space-age tech landing not in the 1900s, but potentially hundreds of years before that, which means humanity could already be centuries into exploring the solar system by the time our actual calendar even hits the year zero. None of this is a lock, obviously. History doesn't move in a straight line. But it's not pure fantasy either. It's just what happens when a whole civilization doesn't get forced to rebuild its knowledge from scratch, generation after generation, every single time something goes wrong. So real quick, here's what we actually covered. The Library of Alexandria did not go down in one dramatic fire. That's a myth, and honestly kind of a lazy one once you know the real story. It faded out over about 300 years thanks to neglect, funding cuts, and war damage. A slow bleed, not a single wound, and way less cinematic than the story you probably grew up hearing. And if that decline never happened, the snowball effect on science, medicine, and tech could have shifted human history by centuries, maybe even changed what year you're watching this video in right now. But there's a bigger question we haven't touched yet. If fire didn't wipe out most of the ancient world's knowledge, what actually happened to the rest of it? That story's even wilder than this one. So make sure you're subscribed, because that's exactly what we're getting into next.